Mina, thank you for the tremendous introduction. Equally, she's set a very high bar, which is somewhat worrying, because now I have to somehow meet that expectation, but that's fine. Thanks for staying with us. It's Friday afternoon. It's the end of 2 days. It's been 2 terrific days, but it is the end of it. So thanks to those of you who are still here and still engaged. I'm going to try and make this as interactive and as enjoyable as possible so that we continue to keep the energy levels up in the room right until the end of this. And firstly, kind of before I go into it, one thing that I was just thinking, listening to that panel discussion, is that there are so many common themes that kind of crop up across different themes and topics in our world, in the world of CS. And a number of the things, like some of the tremendous nuggets of information that the guys were sharing there, actually you'll probably see some relevant or applicable, transferable versions of those same principles in what I'm about to talk about. And I will try and do my best. I made some mental notes and some written notes as we were going through. I'll try and do my best to sort of reference them as we do. But I thought I should start with maybe an apology, which is maybe an unusual way to start things. But the reason for that is because my company that I work for is Signal AI. So we're a SaaS-based business, and we offer an AI-based solution that basically tells people what the world thinks about stuff. So the way that I summarize it, please don't tell my marketing department I've ignored the beautiful narrative, but the way that I tend to summarize it is that we tell you who's saying what, about what, where, and in what context. So as I say, we're a SaaS solution, and so I apologize that I might lean towards maybe some of the retention challenges around that type of business model. But I have done my darndest to remain objective and also think outside of that box and think about how retention challenges can be faced in different business models as well. So hopefully this will be applicable regardless of products and offerings and services. Right, so apologies out the way, very British way to start a presentation. We do love one of those. You may have some questions as to why I called this Eating the Retention Elephant. Firstly, one, I love a good analogy, right? I like to tie stuff back to things. But secondly, it's a massive subject, right? Retention is such a huge component of what we do. And one way or another, whether we directly own it or whether we indirectly own it, we are in some way responsible for what happens at the end of that. And I'd wager for probably a lot of us, it might be our single biggest, I'm going to say, headache or opportunity, depending on how positive you're feeling about it at any one point in time. So I thought maybe I'd start, if it's okay, if we can do a little bit of participation just to give me a read on the room and how you guys feel about it. Please, would you raise your hand if your CS team are responsible for, let's start simpler. Raise your hand if you have renewals as part of your business model. Okay, and if you could leave your hand up if your CS team are responsible for that. Okay, I find this fascinating because different organizations obviously have different approaches. The most recent kind of summary of that I read from a load of data was about 50% of CS teams now own the renewals in their businesses, and about 50% obviously don't, which is really interesting. Okay, let's go up a notch, and you tell me if this is going to work or not. Would everybody mind standing up? Should we do a stand-up game? Like I said, we'll get some Friday energy on the go. I hope this works, otherwise this will also be a bit humiliating for me as well. Okay, so let's think about this. So we now know that probably in this room, I'd say more than 50% of us own the renewal conversations. Remain standing if you are in some way compensated or targeted on renewals. Interesting. So what I'm going to extrapolate from that is that for more than half of the room, again, this is super meaningful. Please be seated. Thank you so much for humouring me. I'm glad it wasn't just a total washout and nobody stood up. Right, so in terms of eating this elephant, like the first thing that I think is relevant to start with is thinking about how you measure success. And in our world, right, in our corner of the island that is customer success, essentially what we're talking about is measuring the success of success, which is somewhat of a mouthful, but is probably fair. So before we kind of get into the strategy, I wanted to frame this question a little bit, because actually how you answer it will have a direct impact on the approach that you take and some of the strategies or tools that you employ to do it. We've already mentioned in the last discussion things like GRR, NRR came up as a question. And we also, I think the question came from over here on my table, which was, how do you create a business case that influences your product team, for example, to support what you might want to do from a CS point of view, which is an excellent question. And we will talk about that a bit more later on, actually. But essentially, there are no shortage of ways in which you can kind of cut this pie, elephant pie, if you like. And hopefully you'll recognise some of those as I talk through it. But I thought I'd maybe give some examples of the different lenses that you can apply, because some of these will resonate with you more than others. So let's think about this from the point of view of a few different perspectives, right? So firstly, there's kind of what I would call the customer lens, and that's things like customer logo retention, volume of retained relationships, NPS scores, CSAT scores, customer tenure, right, can play into that as well, especially if you're on an annualized recurring model, and also things like retention by tier. We talked about, with the kind of digital-led approach, how you can have high-touch relationships and low-touch relationships, and actually a lot of people will take that one stage further and segment their customer portfolios by tiers as well, right? And that could be related to revenue or tenure or what have you. But you might have a different perspective on the importance of retention as it relates to different tenured customers. So it's always an interesting one to think about whether or not you treat those clients differently, right? Based on their experience of your products, your services, your customer success managers, etc. So that's the customer lens. Then there's the more growth-focused lens, and that's maybe thinking about things like expansion of relationships, how much have you grown that client, etc., over the time that you've been working with them, or even perhaps like indexed penetration, right? So let's say you've got a long-tail customer, very low-value relationship with you, but you know that actually they are worth several $billion as an organization. Do you need to be thinking about, from a growth opportunity standpoint, are you under-indexed in terms of that relationship? And then we've kind of got the sales lens, right, which is where you normally would think about things like conversion rates, time to value we mentioned earlier, revenue per customer, per visitor, etc. And then there is a very often overlooked but equally relevant lens here, which is the employee lens, right? Because all of the things that your staff, your employees, the people within your organization do and experience can also have a meaningful impact on your customer retention. So things like opportunities that exist within the organization, staff retention rates, whether you have internal employee engagement surveys and what those tell you, and what you've done about them, perhaps more relevantly. Acting on the information is as important as having the information in itself. But overall, those things all kind of combined are all different ways that we can break this down. All of them, to my mind, contribute towards your overall customer retention, and I'd say most commonly, most of us perhaps focus on measuring retention via what I call the one ring to rule them all metric, right, which is the revenue, depending on how you frame that number. So for some people that might be NRR, for some people that might be GRR, for some people it might be ARR, right, if you're looking at annually recurring revenues. Maybe your model's slightly different. Maybe you're a service delivery partner, or perhaps you're more of a single shot deal, product purchase, ticketing, websites, events, that type of stuff, right? So whatever it is and whoever your customers are, there's always going to be an aspect of this which is relevant to you in terms of how do you ensure that your customers, B2B, B2C, irrespective, are coming back to you, right? Whether they're renewing or whether they're coming back for repeat purchase. You might look at other financial metrics. You might look at total contract values or average order values or average sales prices or, the list goes on, right? Revenue per visitors, and there's plenty of them. But ultimately, your focus, whatever lens you're applying, is in the interests of developing your business. And so that's why 99% of the time, this one ring to rule them all thing's relevant. And coming back to the question from earlier, how do you create a compelling business case, or how do you influence your product organization or your technology team to support what you want to do and get behind your CS initiatives? For me, this is the single biggest way to do it. You can nearly always apply a value, dollars, euros, pounds, whatever currencies you're operating in, but you can always apply a value to any initiative. Because actually, if you're talking about, well, if I do X, then I expect to see a lift of Y in terms of my GRR percentages, for example. And by knowing that and knowing what your book of business is, you can actually put a financial value on that and say, if we implement this, my anticipation is that we see this lift, and that will contribute an extra X number of dollars to us. Now, how important is it, and I'll talk about this a bit more maybe in a second, but how important is it at the moment, given the economy, right, given some of the market conditions that we're all prevailing against us or we're fighting against, that you as an organisation can help contribute revenue and revenue growth, perhaps more so than ever before when you compare it to, I think, anything post about 2008, if anybody was around then and remembers those things. But it's so much harder at the moment to drive new business, right? New business teams are really up against it. Discretionary budgets are being cut, spending's down. And that's one of the problems that we've got as well, right? Because when you come to the renewal conversations, actually it's really difficult because people are having to say, well, we're having to make difficult decisions. We're having to decide whether or not we actually want to continue that relationship. And often, whether or not they do that will be based on whether they've seen value in your product, right? Whether they've been through an onboarding phase and that onboarding was sufficient, fast enough, efficient, right? Whether they've been able to continue utilization, whether you've been monitoring the product usage metrics throughout their life cycle and triggering alerts, for example, to say, we've seen a drop here, we need to do something about it. So, big gold, one ring to rule them all thing. And I wanted to give you like a personal example. By the way, I should apologise. I did include elephants on every slide. I just felt that it would help us remain true to the narrative here. But from personal experience, so us as a business, historically, probably over the last 3 or 4 years, really tracked NRR as our primary metric, right? That was the thing that we were all landing on as, how's our NRR looking? What's our performance? And that's terrific. However, in the last 12 months, we've actually shifted that quite a lot to focus almost entirely on GRR within success. And the reason for that is kind of related to what I was just saying, right, around some of the challenges that we've got at the moment. Because if you're looking at your NRR and you're including your expansion within the metrics that you're tracking, sometimes you mask the problems, right? Sometimes what you don't see it's been diluted by some of the positive stuff that's happening. So we kind of pared it all back and went straight to the GRR number instead, and focused in on what we can do about it. I'm not saying one's better than the other. They're probably both equally useful and both equally valuable. But if you as an organisation, given how many of us had our hands up, how many of us were standing up, if you as an organisation or an individual are focusing on this retention problem, then having GRR as your front and centre driver, for me, at the moment, is a very helpful indicator and perhaps the most effective way to look at what's happening with your retention numbers. Right, so all of that established. Where do we start? Fast elephant comes in. So we've chosen your metrics, so we know what we're going to be talking about, whether it's GRR or whether it's something else. Regardless of what it is, I would suggest always starting by baselining that. So understand what your historical data looks like, understand what your current data looks like. And then from that point, this gives you some of the toolkit that I was just referring to enable you to be able to say, okay, this incremental change is relevant to this big of a lump for us, right? And you can tie the percentages back to values. Establish what that target's going to be, right? Work out what you're aiming towards. Be specific, but be really realistic as well. Stretch goals, terrific, always recommend them. But set something that's achievable because you don't want to fundamentally demotivate yourself or anybody else who's working towards it. And then agree on like repeatable, executable actions that can actually be delivered on week over week over week that are going to impact that somehow. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, but that is one of the key things from my point of view in terms of how you can start to move that needle. GRR, for example, if you're looking at that, it's a lag indicator, right? By the time you see a change in that number, the stuff that's made the change to that number was months ago. In some cases, changes that you make today, you might not see a significant uptick from that until 3 months' time or 6 months' time, because your customer life cycles might be predicated on 12 months, 24 months, 36 months in some cases, right? So whilst that's the case, you need to give yourself something that you can track and monitor and feel good about and feel like you're making a difference during that period. So finding what those particular actions can be that you can execute on week in, week out makes a huge difference. So we've got our baseline. We know what metric we're looking at. So the next thing is analysis. I'm sure that a lot of our panel would echo that, given some of their industries in terms of the value of data, right, and the importance of analysis. And irrespective of how you do this, whether it is Excel or whether you're more sophisticated, makes no difference. But the analysis is really important, because what that does is that allows you to be clear on what's going to help you, right? So let's say that you are using Net Promoter Score data. To what extent is that valuable in identifying retention challenges that you might be facing in your business as a number? Arguably not very much, right? But if you've got qualified information that comes with that, and you've been able to catch a commentary from people that have given you less than ideal ratings, or you've been able to reach out and have your CS team talk to those individuals and find out why that number's not looking good, that then starts to give you information that means you can make strategic decisions to decide how you're going to start moving things forward within, be it your bit of the world, or your product bit, or your technology bit, wherever it is. So once you've got that data, analyze it, but start to break it down, is my suggestion. Otherwise, it becomes sort of this insurmountable challenge, because we've all got access, hopefully, in most cases, I think from the survey, we've all got access to lots of numbers and lots of data, and knowing kind of where to look and sort of seeing the wood for the trees can be a bit of a challenge in itself. But if you break it down, try and establish themes, right, groupings, especially if we're talking about, why are my customers not renewing, or why are my customers contracting their relationships with us? Find some commonalities, right? And then within those themes, within those buckets, if you like, go a few layers deeper and start to build out lists of, here are the practical action-based things that I am going to do that address that particular issue in that particular bucket. I suppose, bring it back to the elephant, like work out how big your elephant is and work out how hungry you are. It's a really big issue to address, and it's very difficult sometimes to know exactly where you want to start in terms of here's what we'll do first. The one thing that I would say, and again, this came up earlier on, try and avoid the old analysis paralysis, as the phrase goes, right? Don't necessarily spend so long thinking about how you're going to do it that you don't start doing it, right? I can't remember what the exact phrase was, but I've written it down because I quite liked it. But it's very similar to your move fast and break stuff, like Google type approach. Shitty first drafts. There we go, right? So don't take too long to get to that point. If it's an MVP and you want to start with an MVP and then iterate on it, terrific, but start moving with it. So you've done your analysis, so then you go into the prioritize phase of this. So at this point, you kind of know what your themes are, you know what you're going to try and start doing to resolve some of these issues. The question at that point is, well, which one do I do first? The way that I would recommend or encourage everybody to think about this is apply two lenses to it, right? One, the sort of speed and complexity trade-off. How difficult is this, and how fast can I get to an end result? And two, do I own it? And this maybe speaks a bit to what we were talking, or what the questions that came up in the previous session. Because if you don't own the problem or the resources that can address the problem, actually putting that as your top priority is going to feel a bit like hitting your head against the wall for some time. So my recommendation would be prioritize what you're going to do based on whether you have control over it and whether it's going to show fast return in terms of your investment of time. Be pretty brutal here. You can have too much, and you can't change everything at once. That's a bit too much of it's like eating the whole leg of the elephant simultaneously. But start doing something, as opposed to kind of trying to analyze the living daylights out of it before you get to that. Okay, and then alignment. Again, I mentioned earlier, there's a couple of parallels to some of the themes from the previous discussion. But the likelihood is you own the customers, right? They're your clients. So you're probably de facto going to own contraction, churn, right, vis-a-vis retention. So, and I've never said vis-a-vis in my life until now, so there you go. So you're probably going to own the retention part of this. Now, even if the reason for some of that contraction or churn is coming from elsewhere in the organization, let's say it is a product issue or a technology issue, it's still probably going to be your problem because you own the customer. So it's really important that you get everybody aligned and kind of pulling in the right direction behind what you're trying to do. So if that means that within your CS teams or within your part of the world, you want to think about incentivizing people differently, having a different structure in terms of spiffs that you're running, or commission plans, or internal competitions. I think somebody mentioned earlier having like monthly, how are we doing against each other? Like that can also be really helpful, really engaging. It gives everybody a little bit more of an edge to what they're doing, and it can be quite good fun, provided everybody is trying to achieve the same objective and pull in the same direction. Basically, don't end up like this guy. He's trying to do it all on his own. It's a terrible plan. So aside from your CS team, the other thing that you need to do is make sure that you've got the rest of your organization focused behind you and supporting you. So in an ideal world, you want to be a bit more like these guys, right? Support. It's much better this way around. Get that C-suite support, right? Get your executive support. And the fastest route to doing that is to prove to them the value of what you're doing in terms of the revenue metrics, right? Which comes back to what I was saying earlier. If you can take here's where we are because I've baselined it, here's where we want to be because that's our objective, and if I do that, this is the return that we can see from this. I found, personally speaking, close alignment with like products, tech, engineering, those types of teams are like really crucial, but it can be hard. It can be really difficult to get them to buy into stuff. And if one of those leaders of those areas of your business are measured on revenue as well, that's terrific, because all of a sudden you've got, happy ears and they want to hear what you've got to say. If they're not, it's almost more important that you've got your executive alignment, because you're going to need to have them wanting to support you or somebody else pushing them to support you, right? And I'm not saying that we want to cause friction internally, but sometimes a little bit of healthy friction is not a bad thing. It can drive everybody forwards. If let's say your COO is telling your CTO that actually this is really important and we need to find space in the product roadmap to fix X problem, because that's why we've had lots of customer churn. Sales and marketing has got a huge part to play in this, by the way. Again, it came up a little bit earlier in terms of onboarding, but to me, I think that's mission critical. But there are also other things like, for example, at what point in the deal cycle does the salesperson exit the relationship? Do they leave as soon as the contract's signed and they're gone on day one and they're no longer involved with that client? Or do they have some kind of shared ownership? Maybe they're involved until like a first delivery milestone or a particular objective, or maybe it's time bound. But irrespective, having some type of backwards accountability means that you avoid some of the problems that I'm sure we've maybe all experienced in the past of, and I have to speak carefully in case the other rooms hear me, but sometimes salespeople will say things to get a deal done, right? They will make promises that aren't necessarily 100% accurate, or perhaps worse, they just will leave out information, right? It's that kind of like non-disclosure thing. Oh, I thought it was going to do this, but it didn't do it. And then you're left with a customer who's saying, oh, well, we didn't sign up for this because we were under the impression that we'd be able to do X, Y, or Z. And now we can't, and we're very unhappy about it, and it's your problem, customer success team, we're not going to renew, and we want to terminate our contract early. Big problem, right? So making sure that you've got those sales teams and also marketing in terms of the messaging that's going out to your prospects aligned behind this is also a biggie. Personally speaking, I'll give you a quick example. I won't belabor this for too long, but we kind of followed this process beginning of the year. So we went through the analysis and the priority phases and et cetera, everything we've just been talking about. And one of the things that we found was that one of the biggest challenges or problems we'd been having was organizational change in our customers. Now, the last few years have been pretty interesting for everyone, right? Everyone's had to change their working models, their approaches. We've all gone from being in the office all the time to being not in an office ever to having hybrid approaches. And there's also been a lot of turnover in companies and in organizations. Roles have been made redundant, teams have been moved on, ownerships have changed, etc. So this organizational change thing was a real problem for us. Actually, it had become our second biggest reason for churn. So, and that had never been the case historically. It hadn't even cropped up in the last 3 years as a top 3, right? So we looked at it and said, well, what can we do? How can we approach this? And one of the solutions that we identified and that we thought would be beneficial is we need to get back to how we used to work with clients. We need to change our operating model a bit. We've come back to hybrid working, and there's an expectation that everybody's going to be on Zoom all the time. But actually, we need to go and spend face time with people, right? We need to go and see people, be in the same place. Albeit sometimes that's tricky because they could be all over the place, but where possible, it makes a massive difference. Because not only does it build the relationship much, much more strongly, it also gives you the opportunity to find out in advance what the risks are or what the areas are that they're not happy with. If there is dissatisfaction, whatever that word is, but if they are dissatisfied for any reason, you understand further in advance what it is. And if you know that, you can start to solve for it, right? You can start to mitigate it. And if you've got a few months left of your relationship, hopefully a bit longer, then you can start to resolve those issues before they turn into churn or contraction. So we did that. We've been doing that over the last 12 months, as I say. We've also been doing a load of other stuff, obviously. But for us, we've seen a massive uptick, like all up and to the right. Is that the right way for you guys? Up and to the right in terms of our GRR numbers. Not just from this, from a number of other things as well, but we've seen a 10% increase in our GRR. Like 10% is huge, right? I mean, it depends what your number was to start with, but ours was pretty good. It wasn't bad, but 10% is a massive number for us to see a growth on. And now we're looking at other regions in the US or in APAC coming to Europe and saying, how did you do that? How can we replicate that model? We want to do the same thing. So, put it all together, and I'll kind of wrap us up really quickly. Firstly, organize, right? Get your house in order. That's kind of what this is supposed to show you. Find out what you're going to do. Specifically, make sure you're monitoring stuff. Customer health, for example. If you're not looking at that really closely and you don't have a number of metrics feeding into that, that can leave you with a massive risk. Then face up to it. Sometimes you have to hear home truths. Some people are going to need to hear that their babies may be ugly, right? You have to have those difficult conversations with the product teams. But you've got to accept it, right? Before you can do something about a problem, you have to admit you have one, all of that stuff. So facing up to it's really important. And be realistic. Historically, for example, we wouldn't have necessarily considered negotiating on price at a renewal very much. We'd have said it devalues our brand. We don't need to do that. We're a premium solution compared to what of our competitors. Well, actually, at the moment, I'd much rather have 75% of something than 100% of nothing. And so from that perspective, given the other challenges and the other headwinds that are in place in the marketplace, maybe it's time to reassess that strategy and make sure that you're doing the right things. And that is kind of taking me on to my penultimate point, which is your renewal strategy. What does it look like? How far in advance are you having those discussions? Are your team empowered, enabled? Have you given them sufficient toolkits? Do they know what the levers are that they can pull, how they can negotiate, how they can counteract issues with customers? And have you adjusted it specifically for market conditions? When COVID happened and everybody had to start working remotely all the time, we all changed our strategies, right? We all changed how we operated. Right now, we're impending / at the beginning of recession. Everybody's having quite a difficult time. Like I said, all those budgets are being cut. Have we changed our strategy as a result of that? Have we started thinking differently about how we need to approach our renewal conversations? And then lastly, process. I went for a procession. I couldn't find a process picture that I liked, so I went for a procession. But process, so decide on what you are measuring, right? Gather that feedback, analyze your data, work out what your key areas are, and then create meaningful, repeatable actions that your team can deliver on a regular basis to feel like they're moving that needle forwards and that they're not just looking at a metric that's not changing. Prioritize those, start executing them. If it needs to be one at a time, do it one at a time, but start that process. And share the ownership, right? If you can, however you want to do it. We used a RACI, which is a really interesting way to do it because it meant that I could assign different things to different people, and it meant that it's not all on your shoulders, because that's another problem. This is part of the elephant. You can't do it by yourself, right? So bring other people into the conversation, and then review it regularly. And then once you're kind of 100% complete in one theme or bucket or whichever area you've been looking at, then think, right, now we can move on. But don't dilute that too much. Don't try and do too much at the same time. Ultimately, if you kind of take all of those things, weave them up together and apply them to your specific businesses, then in an ideal world, you'll be having the elephant for dinner. And that's me out of time, but thank you very much.
Do we have questions for Tim? Oh, we all run out of elephants.
Everyone's all questioned out.
Over there. think.
I can just say, did
Yeah.
you draw the elephant?
Sadly, art is not one of my fortes. I'm a guitar player, so I'm quite creative, but I can't draw for love nor money. So definitely not, no. Otherwise, you wouldn't have known.
Endearing, I was like, you got this little elephant there.
I managed to find a rich vein of elephant images, so yeah. Yeah.
Wow, that is, I feel for you. It was the last session, but it was amazing. So thank you again, Tim.
Pleasure.